In 2025, sudden tariff cuts from 145% to 30% triggered a rapid surge in imports and severe port congestion. U.S. supply chains are strained, and inflation risks are rising. How will these trade policy swings reshape American consumers and businesses? In April 2025, the Trump administration imposed a 145% tariff on Chinese imports, sharply reducing trade flows between the two nations. This move caused immediate disruptions in supply chains and higher costs for U.S. businesses. But in May, the tariff was unexpectedly lowered to 30% for a 90-day period, prompting American companies to rush import orders. Shipping bookings from China to the U.S. spiked over 50% in the first week of May, as firms scrambled to secure inventory before potential tariff reinstatement. Despite the tariff reduction, American consumers continue facing rising prices due to increased shipping and warehousing costs. Economists warn this volatility could drive inflation higher and push the U.S. economy toward recession if trade uncertainties persist. The inflation outlook remains fragile, with transportation cost increases directly impacting consumer goods prices. These tariff swings mean higher prices on everyday products, tightening household budgets, especially for middle and lower-income families. Increased import costs affect retail prices nationwide, while inflation pressures reduce purchasing power. Businesses face uncertainty in pricing and supply availability, complicating planning and investment decisions. U.S. ports like Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Seattle experienced extreme fluctuations due to the tariff changes. April saw a 44% drop in cargo volume at Long Beach, reflecting stalled imports amid high tariffs. But in May, cargo surged sharply as importers rushed goods before tariffs could rise again, leading to severe congestion. The ports oscillated between near inactivity and overwhelming demand within weeks, disrupting logistics and increasing delays. Port congestion delays goods reaching shelves, causing shortages and erratic product availability. Consumers may face empty shelves or delayed deliveries, impacting sectors from electronics to groceries. This congestion also increases operational costs for retailers, which can be passed on to consumers through higher prices. The ripple effects extended beyond the ports. Trucking firms like J.B. Hunt and Union Pacific reported record demand amid supply chain stress. Retailers Walmart and Target warned of product shortages and rising prices. The $906 billion U.S. trucking industry expects a crucial recovery period during the back-to-school shopping season, hinging on steady import flows. Supply chain pressures increase prices and reduce product variety, directly affecting household spending decisions. Transportation, bottlenecks, and shortages risk disrupting retail promotions and seasonal sales, adding financial strain to American families. Ongoing tariff uncertainty hampers long-term business planning, especially for small and medium enterprises struggling to adapt to fluctuating trade policies. Consumers face risks of price instability and inconsistent product availability. Experts urge the government to implement clearer, more stable trade rules to support economic resilience and protect the American public from volatility. Without stable policies, businesses hesitate to invest or expand, potentially slowing job growth and economic recovery. Consumers bear the brunt of unpredictability, experiencing price swings and supply gaps that affect daily life and economic confidence. Intense negotiations between the U.S. and China in Geneva have concluded with a framework agreement aimed at temporarily easing the trade war, yet, with gold prices hitting record highs and American businesses continuing to warn of policy risks, the question remains, is this truly a victory for the U.S. economy? On May 12, 2025, after 2 days of negotiations in Geneva, the U.S. and China reached a temporary agreement to reduce tariffs for a 90-day period. Under the deal, the U.S. lowered tariffs on Chinese goods from 145% to 30%. China reduced its tariffs on U.S. goods from 125% to 10%. The tariff reductions are expected to ease price pressures on imported goods, especially in sectors like toys, apparel, and electronics. However, the 30% U.S. tariff remains significantly higher than previous levels and may continue to affect consumer prices and product choices. The agreement includes a phased tariff reduction mechanism contingent on China fulfilling commitments to open its markets and end currency manipulation. However, prominent U.S. business leaders, including Warren Buffett and Jamie Dimon, have voiced concerns. High tariff levels are hurting domestic companies, and there's a lack of transparency in trade policy. The uncertainty surrounding trade policies could lead to price volatility and weakened consumer confidence. As a result, American consumers may continue to face unstable prices and limited product choices, at least in the near term. President Trump signed an executive order aimed at maximizing the extraction of minerals, timber, and seafood in Alaska. The move boosted shares of gold mining companies like U.S. Gold Mining Inc., USGO, with gold prices soaring to a historic high of $3,400 per ounce in early May 2025. Rising gold prices may increase production costs in industries that rely on gold, such as electronics and jewelry, potentially leading to higher prices for consumers. While the temporary U.S.-China trade agreement has eased tensions and provided short-term benefits for American businesses and consumers, the core issues in bilateral trade relations remain unresolved. U.S. consumers should be prepared for further policy shifts and market volatility ahead.
Case IH, a $34.5 billion. Agricultural equipment giant withdraws from the U.S. Over 3,000 American workers lose their jobs. Towns reel and farmers face part shortages mid-season. Following Case IH's exit, could this shock mark the beginning of a global restructuring wave pulling out of the United States? In early April 2025, Case IH, the tractor and agricultural machinery brand under CNH Industrial, unexpectedly issued an internal memo announcing the closure of all its manufacturing facilities in the United States. This includes the main assembly plant in Racine, Wisconsin, and the engine production center in Fargo, North Dakota. According to CNH Industrial, the decision is part of a global strategic restructuring, shifting operations to Brazil, Germany, and India to leverage lower labor costs and tariff incentives. Case IH's withdrawal immediately resulted in over 3,200 American workers losing their jobs. The move delivers a significant blow to the $34.5 billion U.S. agricultural machinery industry, already under strain from global competition and rising material costs. Post-pandemic, the National Farmers Union warned Case IH's exit puts 1 in 4 large farms in the Midwest at risk of operational disruption due to a lack of timely replacement parts. Beyond the direct layoffs, thousands of indirect jobs across the supply chain, from forges and transport firms to control software companies, are also at risk of being wiped out. In Racine, Wisconsin, where the Case IH plant had operated since 1969, over 1,800 workers were laid off. The town, once reliant on agricultural equipment manufacturing, now faces widespread economic collapse. According to the local planning department, unemployment in Racine surged from 4.3% to 11.7% within just 2 weeks of Case IH's announcement. Businesses surrounding the industrial zone reported revenue drops of 50–70%. A local bank noted 30 mortgage delinquencies in less than 10 days. In Fargo, public schools were forced to merge 12 classes and lay off 14 teachers as families began relocating. Mike Thompson, 52, an assembly line worker, told Reuters, "My dad worked here, and so did I. Now, I've lost my job, and my daughter can't continue college because she lost her scholarship from the company." The Red Racers youth team, sponsored by Case IH for 15 years, had to disband due to lack of funding. Many families have moved to other states for work, creating housing and social service crises in their new communities. Case IH's shutdown has paralyzed the U.S. parts distribution system. Sensors now take up to 6 weeks to arrive. Hydraulic hoses are nearly impossible to source. Farmers in Iowa and Illinois report equipment breakdowns they can't repair. Warranty requests are piling up. Some are resorting to 3D printing parts or switching to John Deere and Kubota machines, which now offer discounts and fast delivery. Dealerships and technicians are also severely affected. Over 400 authorized service centers face potential closure or mergers. Trust in Case IH has crumbled. Many farmers accuse the company of concealing its exit plans since 2023. Used Case IH tractors are now being sold off at 30 to 50% below market value. At agricultural fairs, Case IH's signature red color has all but disappeared, replaced by competitors handing out free merchandise to attract new customers. Vocational schools have stopped teaching. Case IH repair courses and the company's scholarships have vanished. Meanwhile, local agricultural startups are rising with a farmer's first philosophy, offering a glimmer of hope for the industry. Car prices are rising, jobs are gradually disappearing, and Americans are struggling in the midst of a shifting economic landscape. What is happening to the auto industry, once the pride of the United States? Tariffs and protectionist trade policies have driven production costs sharply higher, pushing the price of American-made vehicles to record levels. According to Edmunds, by early 2025, the average price of a new car has surpassed $50,000 USD, while used vehicles are nearing $32,000 USD. With incomes failing to keep pace, many consumers are left with no choice but to hold on to older cars, even as maintenance costs continue to rise. Cox Automotive reports that a standard oil change, once around $50 USD, now exceeds $100 USD. Hourly wage earners and those on fixed incomes are bearing the brunt of this burden, particularly as broader living costs, from groceries to gasoline, rise in tandem with the new wave of tariffs. McKinsey notes that 75% of American consumers have shifted to buying cheaper goods, primarily food, due to tightening household budgets. At the same time, unemployment is spreading. The manufacturing sector is seeing a jobless rate of 5.2%. Construction has shed 34,000 jobs, and agriculture has experienced a 3.8% reduction in its workforce. These losses stem from rising raw material costs, declining export demand, and widespread order cancellations, all of which are forcing families to cut back on spending, weakening purchasing power across the broader economy. As American car prices rise and deliveries slow due to parts shortages, Japanese and Korean automakers are gaining ground, thanks to competitive pricing and more agile supply chains. In 2024, Toyota captured 12.5% of the U.S. market. Hyundai Kia held 10.2%, and Honda accounted for 8.1%. These vehicles are known for their durability and fuel efficiency, qualities especially valued amid the steep increase in fuel prices, driven by new import tariffs. Hyundai has announced plans to invest $21 billion USD by 2028 to build electric vehicle and steel manufacturing facilities, expected to create an additional 100,000 jobs and stimulate regional economies. In contrast, many American automakers have been forced to scale back production due to rising costs, leading to widespread layoffs. This has reduced consumer access to domestic models, while further pushing up the price of American-made cars. The shift toward Japanese and Korean vehicles also reflects a broader trend, a trend toward more frugal consumer behavior. With U.S. economic growth projected to slow to 1.4% in 2025, down from 2.2% previously, according to McKinsey, many Americans are adjusting their spending habits in anticipation of leaner times. The 25% import tariff has driven up car prices by an average of 13.5%, or roughly $6,400 USD per new vehicle. This price spike not only strains consumers, but also directly affects manufacturing and exports. Ford has halted exports of the F-150, Mustang, and Bronco to China in response to retaliatory tariffs of 150%. Stellantis has laid off 900 workers across 5 plants, while Volvo has announced job cuts ranging from 550 to 800 positions. Current trade policies are weakening the U.S. auto industry, leading to declining revenues, job losses, and reduced access to domestic vehicles for American consumers. Without timely adjustments, U.S. market share for American-made cars could fall below 40% within the next 5 years. The inflationary pressure driven by tariffs is also spreading to other sectors. In agriculture, the unemployment rate surged to 12% in March 2025, the highest in years. This reflects the broader, cascading impacts on the overall economy and the daily lives of millions of Americans. EU diversifies partners, looks to internal market to counter potential 144 billion euros loss. Could these strategies safeguard Europe's supply chains and global standing against pressure from Washington? In 2023, the European Union was the world's largest trading power, accounting for 16.1% of global trade, valued at 7.6 trillion euros, according to Eurostat 2024. The U.S. remains the EU's largest trade partner, representing 17% of EU trade, equating to 1.6 trillion euros. However, this trade relationship lacks any free trade agreement, FTA protection. Under former President Donald Trump, the U.S. imposed tariffs of up to 25% on imported cars from the EU and 10% across the board. Alarmingly, Trump's trade advisors are suggesting a return of a 20% tariff on all EU goods within the first 3 months if he re-enters the White House, according to Bloomberg. According to the European Commission, a retaliatory tariff war at 25% could reduce EU exports to the U.S. by 17.5%, causing a direct loss of 0.54% of the EU's GDP, which is equivalent to 144 billion euros, according to a European Commission trade impact study. U.S. consumers would face sharp price increases on imported goods from Europe, including cars, wine, and industrial equipment. The Brookings Institution predicts core inflation could rise by an additional 0.3 percentage points if these tariffs are reinstated, according to Brookings. To reduce dependency on the U.S., the EU is accelerating FTA negotiations with emerging economies. India is a top priority. If an FTA is concluded, the import tariff on cars could drop from over 100% to just 10%, according to Reuters. Bilateral trade between the EU and India is projected to reach 167 billion euros by 2026, with EU exports totaling 75 billion euros and imports from India reaching 93 billion euros. Additionally, a deal with Mercosur, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay could boost total trade to 126 billion euros, with the EU exporting 77 billion euros and importing 49 billion euros. For Mexico, improving market access alone could increase EU exports by 20%, or 10 billion euros. In total, if all 3 FTAs are approved before 2026, the EU could recover around 91 billion euros, though it would still fall 53 billion euros short of the losses from the US. Alongside expanding partnerships, the European Commission is calling for improvements to the EU's single market, established in 1993. While barriers to goods have been removed, 3 key pillars, services, capital, and labor, still face significant hurdles due to national laws. For example, Polish plumbers must recertify to practice in Belgium. Startups in Portugal struggle to raise funds from the Netherlands due to differing investment laws. And EU citizens face bureaucratic obstacles when working in other member states. According to a new study by the European Parliament, this lack of integration costs the EU 1.1 trillion euros annually, 279 billion euros from services, 415 billion euros from the digital market, 300 billion euros from goods, and 50 billion euros from public procurement, according to European Parliament policy study. If reforms are implemented, the EU could fully recover the 144 billion euros loss from U.S. tariffs, while also boosting its internal competitiveness. American farmers are enduring a brutal economic fallout from trade wars with exports, collapsing production costs, soaring and no solutions in sight. Can the U.S. agriculture sector survive this disaster? Sorghum exports to China have dropped 95%. In just 2 months of 2025, U.S. sorghum exports plummeted from 1.4 million tons to just 78,000 tons compared to the previous year. China once bought 90% of U.S. sorghum, but the market has vanished almost overnight. Other major crops like soybeans, corn, and wheat are also suffering, with prices falling and stockpiles growing. This sharp decline in demand is leaving U.S. farmers with millions of tons of unsold crops in silos, significantly hurting cash flow. The lack of buyers is pushing family-owned farms to the brink of extinction, especially as prices continue to plummet with no market alternatives in sight. China has raised tariffs to over 125% on a broad range of U.S. agricultural products, including soybeans, pork, corn, cotton, and dairy. In addition, the EU has also imposed 25% tariffs on key U.S. farm exports, like soybeans and processed pork, in retaliation for U.S. steel tariffs. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Russia are now filling the gaps left by the U.S., signing long-term trade deals that are shifting global supply chains. Permanently, farmers are seeing their once dominant positions in global markets erode with tariffs, pricing U.S. goods out of major markets like China. The agricultural sector faces long-term structural losses that will be hard to recover from. American farmers are now competing with cheaper products from other nations, leaving them vulnerable to further losses. A New York dairy farmer is facing an additional $2,200 in costs for livestock feed due to new tariffs on Canadian imports. Prices for fertilizers, seeds, and machinery are all on the rise because of tariffs on U.S. trading partners, putting immense pressure on farmers' budgets. Meanwhile, crop prices are falling, creating a double squeeze on U.S. farmers' profits. The escalating costs of production are making it increasingly difficult for farmers to turn a profit. With the prices of essential farm inputs like feed and fertilizer rising, and crop prices declining, many farmers are struggling to cover their basic operating expenses. The economic pressure is mounting, threatening their ability to stay afloat. Rural banks are warning of rising default risks as farmers face growing pressure from unstable crop prices and mounting debt. Many farmers are hesitant to sign contracts due to market volatility, fearing they will grow crops no one will buy. Despite some calls for new bailout packages worth billions, many farmers are voicing a preference for trade deals over government checks. As the financial crisis deepens, farmers are facing a real threat of bankruptcy. The increasing instability in the agricultural sector is putting banks and small rural economies at risk. The proposed government relief packages are seen as short-term solutions, with no clear path to restore long-term market access and stability. China's silent trade retaliation is shaking U.S. industries from aircraft and autos to finance. In what could become the most severe supply and trade disruption since 2020, is the American economy ready for a prolonged decoupling from its largest manufacturing partner? China has quietly suspended acceptance of 84 Boeing aircraft, including 737s and 787s, originally scheduled for delivery in Q2 and Q3 of 2025. This move is seen as retaliation against the 145% tariffs the U.S. imposed on over $300 billion of Chinese goods during the Trump era. Within just 48 hours of the report leaking, Boeing lost more than $28.4 billion in market capitalization. Meanwhile, Airbus shares surged by 11.2%, as Chinese airlines shifted orders to Europe. Thousands of workers at Boeing factories in Washington and South Carolina now face potential layoffs. Hundreds of U.S. suppliers are also at risk. Additionally, airfare prices, both domestic and international, could rise due to fewer new aircraft and increased production costs. In early April, Chinese exports to the U.S. plunged by 47%. Over 71,000 overdue containers are now stranded at Shanghai port, while 27 cargo ships remain anchored outside the port of Los Angeles, pushing unloading times up to 96 hours. The cost of shipping a 40-foot container from China to Long Beach has surged from $2,000 to over $7,300 within 2 weeks, a jump of more than 250%. Amazon suspended all imports from China on April 7th, while retail chain Five Below canceled $67 million in orders within just 36 hours. Consumers across the U.S. are now facing widespread shortages of household goods. Electronics and apparel prices are soaring online. Orders are increasingly delayed or canceled, and basic living expenses are climbing sharply. Ford has halted production of its F-150 Lightning pickup due to a shortage of microcontrollers, sourced from Shenzhen GM, has cut battery module production by 60% because of inverter shortages. In just the second week of April, nearly 41,000 vehicles were stuck in production delays, causing over $1.6 billion in losses. Hybrid vehicle prices have risen by 6.8 to 8%, and the Ford Mustang Mach-E's MSRP has been adjusted upward due to increased transportation costs. Nationwide used car prices have jumped 4.1%, the fastest pace since the 2021 chip crisis. The dream of owning a new fuel-dash, efficient or electric vehicle is slipping out of reach for many Americans. Used cars are becoming more expensive. New car delivery times are stretching from weeks to months, and overall vehicle ownership costs are surging, putting more pressure on middle-dash class budgets. While U.S. companies are shifting manufacturing away from China to countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico, infrastructure, labor quality, and product standards in these regions have yet to match China's capabilities. Meanwhile, China is tightening its exports of rare earth minerals, critical for electric vehicles and defense equipment. As of Q1 2025, the U.S. still depends on China for 78% of its rare earth imports. The failure to fully diversify is slowing recovery across key U.S. industries, from high-tech to defense. Consumers are facing higher prices for goods as production costs rise, while job creation in domestic manufacturing falls short of expectations. The United States has just imposed a 20% tariff on goods from the European Union, while the United Kingdom faces a lower rate of 10%. This raises the question: why is Northern Ireland, once regarded as stable after Brexit, now at the center of this latest trade tension? On April 9, 2025, President Donald Trump announced a new wave of import tariffs, targeting nearly all of the United States' trade partners, referring to the move as Liberation Day. In this announcement, the European Union, EU, faces significantly increased costs, with a 20% tariff applied to all goods exported to the U.S., totaling over $500 billion in 2024. In contrast, the United Kingdom is subject to a lower rate of just 10%, with an export value of around $78 billion, clearly gaining a distinct advantage. The discrepancy in tariff rates between the EU and the UK creates an imbalance in the competitiveness of European countries within the US market, particularly in sectors such as pharmaceuticals, where EU exports reached $104 billion, along with premium consumer goods and technology. This also partly reflects President Trump's strategy of differentiation, as he has consistently emphasized close ties with the UK as it remains within the EU's customs union and single market under the Northern Ireland Plus Protocol, which is part of the Brexit agreement. This intermediary position makes Northern Ireland especially vulnerable to disruptions arising from international trade conflicts.